Good morning. We want to welcome all of you who are with us this morning, whether you're on site or online. And whether you're on site or online, we want you to know that you can join us in this mission of learning to live a life of love. If you live in the local area, we'd love for you to join us on site next Sunday morning. But if distance or health concerns mean that online is the best approach for you, we want you to know that you can be a full member of this church online. It may be that our focus on deep spiritual formation and radical inclusion is just not something that you can find where you live. And so we'd love for you to make your home with us online. And even if you have a faith community where you live, we'd love to be a resource for you, to encourage you, to equip you to live and to love right where you are. You'll find the whole services of our Sunday morning worship service on our Facebook page. They're archived there. You can share them with friends. You can enjoy them later. You'll find the sermons archived on our website. And if you'd like to start receiving our weekly emails, reach out to us through the front page of that website. In January, Kendra, our son Jacob, our dog Dasher, our cat Lacey, and I drove 1,128 miles from Memphis, Tennessee to Stamford, Connecticut. About halfway through that journey, we stopped and we stayed in a hotel in Roanoke, Virginia. We picked that particular hotel because it had larger rooms and it would take our dog and our cat, no questions asked. It was a very brief stay. We got there about 8 p.m. We left about 9 a.m. A temporary stay. Once we got to Stamford, we stayed for several days with friends Art and Julie. They graciously, generously opened up their home for us, and we loved staying with Art and Julie. But after about 6 days, that big orange truck full of our stuff arrived from Tennessee, and we had to move everything from that truck into the house. Even as good as our stay was with Art and Julie, it was just a temporary stay. And now, 1266 High Ridge Road is our home. It's not a hotel where we just stay for one night. It's not the house of friends where we crash for several nights. It is now our home, the place where we live and do life together. And that's the image that Jesus uses in our text this morning. This word translated abide is found 10 times in these 11 verses. Our English word abide and abode are very similar. This word translated abide means to dwell, to make your home. What Jesus means by this word is not something that's temporary, like a stay in a hotel. It's not something temporary, like crashing a friend's house for several nights. It is something more permanent, a place where you make your home. Jesus says he abides in the Father abides in him, and we are to abide in Jesus. The permanency of this word is also found in the image that Jesus uses. Jesus uses the image of a grapevine and its branches. These branches abide in the vine. They dwell in the vine. The branches make their home in the vine. At the entrance to the temple in Jerusalem, there was this larger-than-life sculpture of a grapevine and its branches. It may be that Jesus is even pointing to that as he gives this teaching. He's certainly pointing metaphorically back to the Old Testament, and the many times the Old Testament uses this image of grapevines and branches to talk about the people of God, like Isaiah chapter 5. There is no other home you would want if you were a branch than the vine. If you are a branch and you were looking for a new home, the only houses on the market that you would consider would be a vine. Branches make their home in the vine. Now, with that image in mind given to us by Jesus, I want to make 2 points of application. Here's my first point in one phrase, and then I'll unpack it. When it comes to living in a relationship with Jesus, We are called to abide rather than to advance. There are many people who approach their spiritual life with the opposite image, an image that says, Jesus and I are apart, and therefore I must advance because of Jesus' holiness and my unholiness. Even after my baptism, even after my confession of faith in Jesus, there is a gap between us, and I must do everything possible to close that gap. Books and preachers and podcasts talk all the time about growing closer to God, growing closer to Jesus, as if there is this gap, and we must advance in order to close that gap. I remember talking to an older member of the congregation where I first began preaching. She was near death, and she said something like this to me: I hope that I go to heaven when I die. And there was uncertainty in her voice. I knew her well, and I knew she had no reason for that uncertainty. And yet here she was, after a lifetime of following Jesus, still with the perception that there remained some gap between her and Jesus, a gap that needed to be closed so that she could be sure that she would go to heaven when she died. That is a hard way to live life. That way of living life brings anxiety. That way of living life does not result in any joy or any comfort. And it is not the way of life that Jesus describes in this text. Instead, Jesus invites us to have a different image, one that says Jesus and I are adjacent, and so I must abide. The image in this text is not of a vine far over here and branches far over here, and the branches have to do something to get closer to that vine. The image is of a vine and its branches adjacent to one another. The branches intimately, completely tied into the vine. There's no distance at all between the two. And so the branches merely have to abide. Now, this calls for two primary postures in our spiritual life: savoring and sustaining. Spirituality is not about striving for a connection with Jesus that we do not yet have. It is about savoring and sustaining a connection with Christ that we already do have. Kendra is the supreme savorer in our marriage. I learned so much about savoring by watching her. Savoring is about enjoying something fully that's already in our possession. And so often, I'm the one in our marriage who'll just kind of go through life barely even acknowledging the great things that are happening, like a connecting phone call with a family member or a beautiful snowfall in our backyard. But Kendra savors these things. She's expressive. She's abundant with joy as these things are happening in the moment. And that's what the reality of abiding in Jesus makes possible. We already possess more in Christ than we could ever fathom because we are already intimately tied together with Him. There is so much to enjoy in this moment when it comes to Christ. Spirituality is really just about savoring His presence. It's about savoring His provision. It's about savoring this intimate relationship that already exists. And it's about sustaining. Spirituality is not about striving for some connection with Christ that we do not yet have. It is about savoring and sustaining this relationship that we already do have. Now, I need to note that this is language that applies to those of us who have confessed our faith in Jesus, who've been baptized in the name of Jesus. If you haven't taken those steps, then there's a start that you need to take on your own, confessing your faith, being baptized into Christ. But for those of us who've taken that step, the call now is simply to sustain. You might think about it like this. There's a difference between moving into a home and making a home. When that big orange truck of ours finally arrived from Memphis here in Stamford, Kendra and I and a host of others moved every item that we owned from that big orange truck into the rooms of our house at 1266 High Ridge Road. We moved into that house in a matter of hours. But it is taking weeks for us to make ourselves at home there. In fact, it's probably something that we will spend weeks and months and years doing. It's one thing to move into a home. It's another to make yourself at home. And that's what Jesus is inviting us to do here. Through faith in Christ, we've moved in. We've started dwelling. And now the call is to make our home in Him, to sustain by practices and habits and ways of living this dwelling that has started between us and Jesus. Now, there's another important contrast in this text that's related to this idea of abiding, and it has to do with suffering. Because of our own culture, we've been sort of socialized to pursue a pain-free life. But in our relationship with Jesus, things must be very different. In our relationship with Jesus, we're called to abide rather than to abolish. Let me unpack that. Right now, I am engaged in a hunt that is lasting weeks, that is designed to abolish a particular pain in my life, the pain of cold hands. Now, I know this probably sounds ridiculous for those of you who spent years in the cold Connecticut winters, but when my hands get cold, they literally hurt. Recently, in one of the many snowfalls that we have had this winter, Kendra and I were walking through our neighborhood. Her hands were nice and toasty, and my hands were throbbing. And so I'm now on my third pair of gloves. I had the thin pair that I had when I got here. I moved to a much thicker pair, and then I ordered a third pair because I thought maybe they would be warmer. And I have to confess to you that I'm about to give in and purchase a pair of mittens. Bernie Sanders mittens. Why? Because I am on a pursuit to abolish this pain in my hands. And many times that is the approach that we take with all pain in our lives. Timothy Keller, in his book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, writes, "Our own contemporary Western society gives its members no explanation for suffering and very little guidance as to how to deal with it." And so because of that, our initial reaction is to abolish pain. Keller tells of Dr. Paul Brand, a pioneering surgeon in the area of leprosy, who spent part of his career in India and part of his career in the United States. And when it came to the United States, Brand wrote this, "I encountered a society that seeks to avoid pain at all costs. Patients lived at a greater comfort level than any I had previously treated, but they seemed far less equipped to handle suffering and far more traumatized by it." But in this text, Jesus teaches something radically different in our relationship with Jesus. We are called to abide in pain rather than to abolish pain. Jesus mentions two kinds of pain that will be experienced by us as we abide in Him: cutting off and cutting back. We abide in the midst of the pain of God's cutting off and cutting back. Jesus has in mind the two pruning seasons for vines and branches. One pruning season would take place in the spring, the other would take place in autumn. The spring pruning included removing the growing tips of shoots so they wouldn't grow too rapidly, cutting off 1 or 2 feet of the end of shoots to prevent them from being snapped off by the wind, removing some of those flowers or grape clusters so that those that remained might be even more abundant. And then removing the suckers that grow underground that sap the strength from the rest of the vine. And then a second pruning occurred in autumn, after the harvest, when the vines were dormant. This involved removing the unwanted branches, maybe branches that grew fruit in one season but were not going to grow fruit in the next season, and cutting back some of those branches so that in the coming growing year they would produce even more fruit than they did before. These vines were cut off or they were cut back. And that pain of being cut off or cut back is what allowed them to produce more fruit in the next growing season. In our relationship with Jesus, there is no produce without pain. Now, that's not a statement about all pain. Some pain that we experienced, perhaps rooted in injustice, is the result of moral evil in our world, and we can seek to abolish that pain for ourselves and for others who suffer from it. Some pain in life, we might call it gratuitous pain, is here because of the brokenness of our world. But some pain in our life, Jesus is saying, carries with it the potential of helping us to become more fruitful in life. It's not always easy for us to clarify whether some pain that we're experiencing is here because of the moral evil in our world, because of the brokenness in our world, or because it's something that God has allowed to come to us. But the bottom line in this text is that God is able to take some pain and to redeem some pain so that it results in greater produce in our lives. Author Jamil Zaki is a professor of psychology at Stanford University, and he wrote recently about the year 2020. On the one hand, he said, events like 2020 result in what we know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Calls to mental health and suicide crisis hotlines soared during 2020. Anxiety and depression were more than tripled compared to 2019. Traditional places of refuge, including schools and church buildings, began to be viewed as threats to health. Economic and social systems collapsed. Wide disparities were magnified through the pandemic. All of that trauma can result in post-traumatic stress disorder. On the other hand, Zeki writes about what is called post-traumatic growth. A 2019 study found that more than half of those who had suffered some kind of trauma reported some kind of growth as a result. More than 60 years of research demonstrates that after bombings, after tsunamis, after earthquakes, after hurricanes, people tend to work together more, act selflessly more, care more deeply for others. Sometimes even trauma can result in fruit. African-American spiritual author Howard Thurman writes that pain has a ministry. Pain can often result in great hardship, and pain can often lead to a greater purpose. He writes this, "It's not unreasonable to assume that we are enriched and joyed by the good and the beautiful and the satisfying. We can accustom ourselves to such things as our due, or as part of the gifts of life to the children of humankind. But what about pain? What about hardships? What about loss? The things that make for misery?" It's perhaps a daring notion to say that pain has a ministry, which adds to the sum total of life's meaning, and more importantly, to its fulfillment. And as pain carries out its ministry, Jesus calls us to do one thing: abide. when there is adversity in our lives, Jesus' answer is, abide in my love. When pain comes, we don't flee. We dig in. We dig down. We make ourselves all the more home in Jesus' love. We don't leave the one who is our home, believing that there might be some way to outrun the discomfort, some better place to weather the discomfort. We close the shutters. We light the fire. We huddle down in the one who is our home. We abide in his love. There's a picture in my office here at the church building. It's a reproduction of a painting by Eugene Delacroix. You can view the original in the Met at New York City. The painting is a reflection of a moment in the Gospels when Jesus and the disciples are facing a terrible time. They are in a boat on the water in the middle of a storm. The boat is going up and down. The faces of the disciples are filled with fear. They want to be anywhere but there. And yet in the middle of that turmoil, in the middle of that trauma, there's Jesus in the boat asleep. And on his face there is the look of peace. How is that possible? I think what Jesus is doing there is what he describes in verse 10 of our text. He is abiding in his Father's love. Even in the midst of turmoil, he has made his home in his Father's love. And so he is able to endure that turmoil with peace. This is the very thing that Jesus invites us to do. As adversity comes to us, as the pruning work of God works through us, we are called to abide in Jesus' love. Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame once wrote about this text in her book, How to Live on Christ. And she said this: how does the branch bear fruit? Not by incessant effort for sunshine and air, not by vain struggles. It simply abides in the vine, in silent and undisturbed union, and blossoms and fruit appear as of spontaneous growth. How then shall a Christian bear fruit? By efforts and struggles to obtain that which is freely given? No. There must be a full concentration of the thoughts and affections on Christ, a complete surrender of the whole being to him, a constant looking to him for grace. May you abide in his love this week. May you dwell in his love this week. May you make yourself at home in his love this week. God bless you.